Of Sociology 3392 research methods, we're going to be talking about the ethics and politics of social research. So we're going to talk a little bit this chapter about some ethical issues in social research, as well as some very unethical studies that have led to sort of the standards that we adhere to today. So ethical, according to Webster's dictionary, conforming to the standards of conduct of a given profession or group. So we have a few different standards that we have to adhere to in order for our research to be unethical. If our research is deemed unethical, we could, face consequences. It's not going to be published anywhere. We're probably going to have some really bad press, maybe even lose our jobs, depending on what went on in the ethical research, the unethical research. So firstly, a very, very important thing is that we need to have voluntary participation. We cannot force people to be part of our research projects. This all came from medical testing that was done on incarcerated individuals. This, hopefully is not done anymore, but there definitely has been a history of using people that are incarcerated to test different sorts of medication on, even things like topical treatments for stuff, even, beauty treatments, these sorts of things, without the people that are incarcerated giving their voluntary participation, saying that, yes, they agree to be part of a research project, rather they would feel forced to participate. So no one, again, should be forced to participate. This is like the bare minimum, bare standards of ethical research. Again, there has to be a balance of science and ethics. Is it possible to always adhere to voluntary participation? Yes, we try to do this. In some cases, there will be studies that people don't know that they're part of a study. And if it's deemed that, yes, this is ethical, then this can continue. But again, anytime you're collecting data from individuals, we want them to have voluntary participation. Another thing that's really important is no harm to the participants. So people being researched should never be injured, whether this be physically, mentally, emotionally, socially, or psychologically. Again, this stems from the fact that we had a few very, very high profile and very unethical research projects that went on in, the mid 1900s. So this includes the people that were incarcerated that were being tested different medications on. So is it possible to eliminate 100% of the risk? No, but we can make it so that it's less likely to be risky. Again, most of the things that we're doing, there's not going to be any sort of physical risk. We're never going to physically injure someone. This maybe is more likely in medical research. In social research, though, it is possible that we're going to emotionally or psychologically hurt someone, and we just try to eliminate the risk as best as we can. Okay, so one very, very unethical, very well-known study that was sort of the catalyst to a lot of these rules changing and ethics to be considered in research is the Tuskegee syphilis study. So this study was done by U.S. Public Health from 1932 to 1972. So this was done in Tuskegee, Alabama, very sort of small town, very, very rural. They looked for people that were living in poverty, rural black men who were suffering from syphilis, which is a common disease of the day. So at this time, they didn't necessarily have a cure that they were like 100% was going to work, but they had figured out that, if you give penicillin to these people, their syphilis will improve or go away. So what they did is they followed up people with syphilis. They gave some of their people, the treatment, and some of them, they did not give the treatment. So they withheld the cure from the disease while the subjects suffered and died of syphilis. They went so far as to, go around to the area hospitals and doctors and tell them not to, give them a list of people not to treat for syphilis because they wanted to see the progression of the disease. So this is very, very unethical because they knew that this, just by giving people penicillin, they were going to make them better. They purposely withheld this penicillin from them so that they would suffer and die, and they could basically watch them suffer and die from syphilis. So results of the Tuskegee study, this was found to be very, very unethical. And it led to the Belmont Report, which is a report made about the importance of ethics in research. So they came up with 3 key principles: respect for persons, so meaning that we need voluntary participation, and establish protected populations as well that need specific protections when doing research on them. This includes minors and people incarcerated and a few other different groups. Beneficence, basically doing no harm. So you're not going to, watch people suffer from syphilis when you know that giving them penicillin is going to help them. And justice. So what's the trade-off here? We want the burdens and benefits shared fairly within society. We want this research to be beneficial. We're not just watching people die from syphilis just to watch them die from syphilis. If there is research that's being done, if there's any sort of risk at all, it has to be for the greater good. So there has to be some sort of payoff. Okay, so something that has came out from the Belmont Report and sort of these unethical studies is informed consent, meaning that we have proof that subjects are voluntary participating and understand the full project and the possible risks involved. So anytime we're going to be doing research here at Texas Tech, when you're doing your research for your project, if you're using human participants, you're going to be giving them an informed consent form. So basically this is just a little here on the left. You're going to name the project, what's it studying, what can you do if you like to participate, what's going to happen to my data, how long will participation take, et cetera, what are the possible negative outcomes of the study, and then you need the participant to sign a date. So this is what we do now to make sure that our subjects, our participants, are informed about the research. Vulnerable populations cannot provide consent, meaning that kids and people incarcerated and people that don't fully understand what informed consent is cannot consent. This does not mean that we can't do research with kids. It just means that we need their parents' consent before we're able to do research with them. Okay, so something that we have to go through here at Texas Tech and any university and any organization doing research is the IRB, or the Institutional Review Board. So each university that does research will have one. Different, maybe schools have one, maybe different organizations have one, et cetera. So the IRB is a panel of experts that review the study beforehand and say whether or not they can proceed with it or whether or not things need to be changed. So here at Texas Tech, we have a panelty of different faculty who, if I want to start a new research project, I will submit my idea to the IRB, and it's very, very detailed about how you're going to protect people, the type of consent you're going to get, who you're looking for your population, what's going to be done with the data, how you're protecting the participants' identities. It goes very, very in-depth. It takes a long time to fill out, and sometimes reviews can take a very, very long time. I've had an IRB take up to 1 year, and lawyers got involved and everything because I was specifically looking for a very, very vulnerable population, which are minors that were incarcerated. So I had 2 of the protected population. So it took a very long time. If you're just doing a project which you guys are going to be doing, you're not going to be using minors or incarcerated individuals. You're just going to be using adults. It could be really quick. It can take a week to do. But if you get into these very vulnerable populations, it's going to take a long time to get through the IRB. So the good news is that you guys, for your project, will not have to go through the IRB. Research in educational settings is exempt, meaning that even though you're doing a research project, it's not going to be disseminated to a larger audience. It's just for the purposes of this class. It's not going to be published. Therefore, we do not have to go through the IRB, which is very good news because it usually takes a long time. So you guys won't have to do that. Also, if you're using secondary de-identified data, meaning that you're using data that someone else has collected and has gone through the IRB, you don't need to go through the IRB. And food quality evaluations don't need to go through the IRB as well. Okay, time for another unethical study. This is the Stanford prison experiment. Zimbardo, he's a very famous psychologist. He was at Stanford at the time. He's done a few very, very well-known experiments in social science fields. So he really wanted to sort of look at the relationship between prisoners and guards. So what he had done is, with the help of some of his graduate students who are working as research participants, they sort of put out a call for undergraduate students to be part of the study. So these participants agreed to be interviewed. I don't remember if they got money for it or not. I think they maybe got paid a small amount. Again, this was in the 70s, so probably not a lot. And they had assigned some of the students to be prisoners and some to be guards. And this took place in the basement of the psychology lab at Stanford. So what Zimbardo wanted to do is sort of just look at the interactions between the prisoners and the guards. So he, the experiment started. It was supposed to be several weeks long. Right away, the prisoners started being psychologically abused by the guards. People really took on their roles. Participants withdrew from the study, but they were not allowed to leave, which is a very, very big no-no. So in research, your participant is allowed to leave and stop at any time. But Zimbardo had his students continue, meaning they said, let me out of here. I do not want to be part of this project anymore. But he, continued to force them to be locked up in the Stanford basement. Again, he did go through the IRB for this, and it was approved, meaning that sometimes, things slip through the IRB and we don't really know the negative effects until later on. Now we see that this is a very, very unethical study. Afterwards, they found that a lot of the people that were involved in the study had, psychological trauma. I believe, it did get better over time, but still it was deemed very, very unethical. And this is a very good example of an unethical study, and one that's talked about a lot in the fields of social science. There's even been, a movie made about it if you're interested in looking at this a little bit further. Since then, Zimbardo, he kind of got a bad name for himself after completing the study. But he did go through the IRB, still ended up being unethical. Okay, something that is very important in social research when you're using human participants is keeping people's identity a secret. And there's two ways of doing this, and they are often used interchangeably, but they are not. And guaranteed this is going to be an exam question. The difference between anonymity and confidentiality. So you have to guarantee either one or the other when you're, doing a research project. Anonymity means that the researcher does not know your identity, and the readers of the study or the people that are looking at the findings will not be able to match an answer or a piece of data with that person. So this is when you don't know somebody's identity. Maybe you're not asking them their name or their address or where they live or whatever. Maybe you're doing an observational research where you're simply observing people and not taking down any information about them. That would be, able to guarantee anonymity. But more often than not, you're not able to guarantee anonymity because, the consent form that needs to be signed and whatnot is going to have somebody's name on it. Therefore, you're going to have to guarantee confidentiality. This means that the researcher can identify a given person's responses. They can, match them to their identity, but they promise not to do so publicly. So anonymity is when the researchers don't know the identity of the people and can keep that, so that they can't match up data to a particular person. Confidentiality is when, yes, the researcher can match up the data with the person's identity, but promises not to do so. Okay. So one big issue in research is deception. Sometimes deception within social research is justified, meaning tricking somebody for the purposes of research. Again, this is a very, sticky situation. We really have to weigh deception with the outcome. So, what are we going to learn about research that is so important? And sometimes, we're able to deceive somebody in their research. However, if it is deemed that deception is necessary for the purposes of research and the IRB allows it, the individuals have to be debriefed after. So after the study is over, after maybe there's an experiment that's over, people have to learn why deception was used, what was done, and sort of the good that's going to come out of it. Okay, so a very famous study that used deception is the Observing Human Obedience study done by Stanley Milgram. So Stanley Milgram wanted to study why people obey authority. So he was really interested in, what went on during Nazi Germany, and why people, adhered to authority even though they felt that what they were doing was wrong. So he, created an experiment that was going to, try to help explain this. So what he did is he deceived his participants into giving fake electric shocks to Confederates. So what a Confederate is, and for the purposes of research, is somebody who is in on the experiment, when deception is taking place. So what Stanley Milgram did is he had people here at, I can't remember what school he was at actually. I don't remember. But whatever university he was at, he had a call out for participants saying that, I'll give you $3 for participating. We want to do an educational study on, it was something like people answering, questions. So what they did is the Confederates, or the people who are in on the survey, were hooked up to fake electrical shocks. And the participants, the people that were being deceived, were telling people that they would ask them a question, and if they got an answer wrong, they had to give them an electric shock. So these people, even though the poor participants knew that they were hurting the Confederates, which they weren't. It wasn't a real electric shock, but they believed that they were hurting them, and the Confederates were moaning in pain and crying out and saying, "Stop, stop!" And Milgram would just say, "You have to continue. Give the shock now." And the participant would administer another shock. Even though many of the participants were very, very distraught about this, they said, "No, I'm not going to do this. I want to stop. I'm, hurting this person. He's obviously in distress. I don't want to shock him anymore." But they were continuing just because they were adhering to authority, which was, Milgram in his white coat. So this was a very, very interesting study when we learned a lot about human behavior and why people adhere to authority. However, it was deemed unethical because the people that were the participants were very, very distraught about, and being tricked, basically, being deceived. However, they were debriefed afterwards. They said, "Look, you didn't hurt anyone. We weren't even looking at, the educational outcomes of the study. The study was actually about why people adhere to authority, even though they don't want to." And again, we learned a ton about this. It was a very, interesting experiment, deemed, a little bit unethical. It did go through the IRB again. It would probably not pass the IRB today. This was back in, I believe, the 50s or 60s, so it was, a while ago. This would not pass IRB today, but again, it was a study that, even though we did deceive people, we learned a lot from it. Okay, so another, unethical study. It's Trouble in the Tea Room. It was done by Laud Humphreys, who was, I believe, a doctoral student. Again, I don't remember what school he was at. So he really wanted to study homosexual activities in public restrooms and parks. So this was, again, back in the 1970s. Homosexual activities was not as accepted as it is today. Obviously, it's still unaccepted in some circles, but it's much more accepted than it was back in the 1970s. And Laud really wanted to sort of learn about the people that engaged in these activities. So what he did is he really inserted himself into this research. So he knew of this park, close by the university or his house or whatever, where men would meet up and have sexual relations in public restrooms in a particular park. So what they had is someone, again, this is when it was still against the law, they would have what they would call a watch queen, which is somebody that would stand outside the restroom and, look out for cops. So Laud would, hang around these restrooms and offer to be people's watch queen. So he would, hang out outside, and he volunteered to become the watch queen, and he wanted to know about the participants' lives. So what he did is he took down everyone who, participated in these sexual relations in the public restroom. He took down their license plate number. He then went to the DMV, and I don't know how he got this information. Maybe he knew someone at the DMV. Maybe it was, a little bit easier to access this information. I don't think this could be done today. But he went to the DMV and got their, name, age, address, etc. He would then show up at their house and do an interview with them. Again, this is very, very, very unethical. These people did not agree to be part of the study. They did not know they were being studied. They did not have, they did not allow Laud Humphreys to collect this information from them. And Laud Humphreys, did not adhere to confidentiality. Lots of ethical issues in question here. Again, this would never get passed by the IRB today. I don't really know what came of Laud, if he was able to use this for his dissertation or not. I'm guessing not, but I could be wrong again. But again, a very good example of something that is very unethical that went on in research. Okay. Another ethical issue happens after you're finished collecting your data. So your analysis and reporting, you are required to report to your colleagues in the scientific community, even if you don't like that answer. So all results must be reported, both positive and negative. There's no cherry picking of results. All limitations must be admitted. You have to report your funding source. So again, you're not allowed to keep things a secret if you didn't like the way they turned out. So maybe you do research and it really goes against a very long-held belief that you once had. You can't just delete all the files and pretend it didn't exist. You still need to report this. You still need to, report it to academic journals, to the funding source, disseminate it to, whoever, post it on your Twitter. You're not allowed to just, pretend your research never happened if you don't like the outcome of it. So the ethics of social research deal mostly with the methodology, so what you're doing, before and during data collection, where political issues tend to center on the substance and use of the research. So what happens to the research after it's been completed? What happens to these findings? Again, there's no formal codes of acceptable political content, so how your research is going to be used. There's not really standards like there is. We have the IRB to make sure everything's ethical before we do the research, but after it's done, there's no governing body that tells us what we need to do. There's a couple, examples of research that, obviously a lot of the research we do in sociology, criminology, psychology is, goes on one side of the political spectrum of another. So we want to remain objective in our science. However, once the results are available, people can use them sort of for however they want. So personal beliefs might interfere with science. So an example of personal beliefs interfering with science is George W. Bush. So he put a ban on federally funded research using stem cells, simply because he had personal beliefs about conception that didn't sort of line up with some stem cell research. So he put a ban on federal funds going towards that kind of research. Here's an example of how politics gets involved in research. Again, there's no governing body that tells us that we can't do this. We want to sort of remain as politically neutral as we can, but of course we're all going to have our, political beliefs, and sometimes these tend to interfere in science. Okay, so just a few key points to end the lecture. Science is not untouched by politics. Science does proceed in the midst of political controversy and hostility. An awareness of ideological considerations enriches the study and practice of social research methods. And whereas researchers should not let their own values interfere with the quality and honesty of the research, this does not mean that researchers cannot or should not participate in public debates. So again, researchers are always going to, be on one side of the political spectrum. They're always going to have their, long-standing beliefs, but we want to try as hard as we can to not let this interfere with science.